So on rooftops of restaurants, there's now these salad bowls of rocket and herbs and things that can go directly into your garden. In Vienna, there's these amazing rooftop gardens which act as, some of it's edible, some of it's just an environment that creates this sense of a beautiful space in a treed rooftop area. And then there's simple little things you can do as a home chef, even with hanging tomatoes and simple little things to add edible sections into your landscape. Still on the rooftops in the middle of London, Reading, which is a little bit away from London, they have this small little terrace garden where they have 140 species of edible plants on this rooftop garden. It's a food forest, layers of orchards and herbs and vegetables. So it's become an education centre as well as a food garden. And it's designed and created by a community, for the community to benefit in however way they wish to use it. So there's so many different ways of transforming parts of our landscape. Supermarket rooftops. Another one in London. This is a new project, a really innovative project that's come out where the rooftop of a supermarket is now being transformed into this edible landscape. And so the food goes straight into the supermarket, and then the supermarket waste gets composted and put back into that garden. So if we want to think about actually how we can do this more, we need to think about how we can design our rooftops and our structures to be able to actually hold and contain rooftop gardens in a far better way. So rather than having to retrofit and do engineering tests, actually design them in the first instance to have spaces for growing food. So many courtyards and spaces, road verges in Seoul, office courtyards, in the middle of an apartment building, a rectangular apartment building in Los Angeles. People are growing food and transforming their places. So people, when they're having their lunchtime in their office in Cuba, they go out to the garden and get their lettuce for their cheese sandwich. Or in Los Angeles, there's a couple of floors of apartment, and the papaya trees are growing up nice and high, so the second and third story reach out and hug their breakfast. It's lovely. Pocket gardens, anywhere you can find. This is in the old capital of Bulgaria, where tiny little pockets of land, of this steeply terraced, rocked landscape, where they're growing grapevines. Just in wonder, they stick out some little areas, a tiny hole for the roots to go in, and the grapevines grow up. Little area for a mixed herb and fruit garden, and then another section, this right on the far end, where it's a guild, and that's like a collection of self-supporting plants. So there's a legume plant which helps to improve the soil, and then they've got this beautiful grapevine coming all the way up, and it's trained so that it goes up on the first level balcony, then it goes up on the second level balcony, and then it goes up on the third level balcony. So all these people up all the balconies get to have grapes all the time, and it provides shade in the summer, and all of the water that comes off the roof and their wastewater gets drained down into that little spot. So they collect their wastewater, feed the plant, and then the plant feeds them. So it's a lovely relationship. Other ways of increasing production too in the urban areas, considering aquaponics. So that's the blend between fish farming and vegetable farming. So the waste food from the vegetables drops into the fish pond and feeds the fish, and then the fish poo in the water, and then that water becomes nutrient rich to feed back into the vegetables. And so these systems can actually be used where you have no soil at all. They can be used in rooftops, they can be stacked into courtyards, they can be designed in so many different ways, and actually the potential is enormous. This is a really great idea that I've come across recently called window farming, and maybe something that's really quite relevant in Hong Kong, where you really don't want to necessarily have something on a balcony in case a typhoon comes along and drops a pot on someone's head below, which could really hurt. Actually, within the enclosed window, having this hydroponic system, and it can be as simple as this sort of prototype system. You can see upturned bottles with a reservoir of water up the top that just dribbles water down. So you can have herbs and leafy greens and even tomatoes and things growing, as long as you've got a bit of a light window there. So that has a real possibility Evan and I were trying to do a bit of a prototype of creating an enclosed balcony garden system where you have, this is just a prototype design that we constructed and put into a Sydney apartment building where you have your terraces of your vegetables to get the light, and below there's a worm farm. So the worm farm is what we use to actually process the food scraps. And out the bottom of that you get this fertiliser, liquid. And then the liquid comes up and gets diluted with some water and feed back down, and then all the scraps go back. And so it's actually this cycle. So all your food scraps go into that, and then all the nutrients from that feed your food garden. So it's actually a really great concept for having a food waste processing and a food productive system on the balcony. And then we're seeing enormous growth in the trend with vertical gardens, and these again are also based on generally on the hydroponic system. But there's also other types of vertical gardens like the espaliers and those kind of grapevines that I was talking about. Ways that you can make fruit trees really narrow to go along the edge of a walkway somewhere. It kind of does your head in when you see this. I always want to think I've got my pictures up the wrong way. But this is, again, a walled garden, edible plants. I've seen a lot of these gardens that are using non-edible varieties, but there's potential enormously to have these along the streets in beautiful sections, you know, down the courtyard of your estate, or using extra space in community gardens. There's a lot of potential too for using universities' grounds to actually have production areas. There's a couple that I've been involved in. One was in the Bahamas in a really degraded area. They basically just had coral, so we collected compost and made a garden that fed all of the students there. Another one is in the university in Davis, California, where it's actually quite an old farm, but the students doing international development learn how to grow food. And that food that they grow actually goes as boxes to all the staff and students in the college. So there may be space in and around universities, maybe not the downtown ones, but ones in new territories. Do you know of space on university campuses that could be utilised? I'm sure there is. Also in schools. Schools have an enormous potential also for becoming places that cultivate gardeners, growers of our future food. It doesn't take much to inspire children to actually get outside and get involved in planting. Young children particularly are very keen to do it. And one of the things I've been involved in trying to do recently is develop curriculum around this. So instead of just being, oh, that's the gardening activity, we'll go out and do it, you go out and do math in the garden, and you measure stuff. You go and do science in the garden, or you go out and do language and literature or art or something in the garden, and use the garden as the outdoor classroom and the learning environment. And so there's enormous potential in that to create contextual learning environments for children. And so if you happen to have the opportunity to be part of the design of a school ground, to think about this possibility, or if you're in educational programs. There's a woman in Australia called Stephanie Alexander. She's actually a celebrity chef. And are you doing it? Is that a time check? She's a celebrity chef, and she's brought attention to food growing and the lack of our connection to our food system, and she's now started up this whole program through her foundation to support edible school gardens happening throughout our country. And I think really looking from how you can get it from the garden to the table, the culinary elements as well, the artistic elements, and taking it to kindergartens. In Cuba I saw a lot of micro-enterprise development happening around that too. So the village women would come and actually grow herbs, dry the herbs, bag up the herbs and sell them as a micro-enterprise, while they were actually teaching the children how to grow food and to transform their landscape into edible area. I'm currently involved in setting up gardens in kindergartens in Malani and school gardens, and also edible playgrounds. I have a student in the Faculty of Planning in Brisbane, who I'm supervising at the moment, who's currently doing research on this. How can we actually create in our cities and suburbs edible playgrounds, so children's playgrounds that have food producing areas that they get involved in, that they can harvest from, and how can we transform quite dull landscapes into things which are alive and living, and you can climb these beautiful mulberry trees and hide in bean, teepee, trellis cubby houses, and the maze is actually a maze of edible flowers and herbs. Children's farms is another way actually of utilising urban land and peri-urban land for farming enterprises, which include also a lot of kind of eco and educational tourism opportunities. But particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, where they're very much more dense cities. For an Australian context, you might think it's low density, but for us it's kind of like really lots of buildings and so the children, it's been recognised, are actually missing that contact with animals and with nature and with open space. And so they've set up these places where they can go and cuddle with animals and milk a cow and ride a horse and experience that kind of farm environment. In the city, you can see behind the cow the CBD of Melbourne. It's just a couple of kilometres on the edge of town. And so I think that could also have a potential use for some of the agricultural land. Peace gardens is another way too. I think of the community gardens as a peace garden, particularly in our age where there's a lot of conflict in the world, and actually focusing with children around the concept of peace and working together with our communities and with our neighbours and in the world and designing food gardens around that. I thought it was quite interesting too that sort of a slight aside that Michelle Obama actually set up a food garden in the Lords outside the White House, and that sent a huge statement about the value of growing food. And if our leaders have the guts to actually go and do a similar sort of thing in all of our countries, whether it be local government, whether it be councils, that our city offices have a food garden in front of them, that they take the initiative to do it. If Michelle Obama can do it in the White House, we could do it in other places. Many of our, not many actually, a few of our local governments are now actually starting to pick up on that. And one of our councils actually surrounded, the council buildings is surrounded by edible landscapes, and it's a really positive move. I think it's important as we're designing these community gardens and food systems in and around the city to keep them accessible, to make sure they're wheelchair accessible and accessible for elderly, so that they're ability gardens as well. I really think it's important not to say, okay, I'm going to design a disability garden so all the disabled can go to that one. You create ability gardens so all people of all abilities can actually be together in the garden together and working together. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in our minds as we're designing them. Ignore the chook. How can we have urban beekeeping? I know there's maybe a couple of beekeepers still around Hong Kong, but finding high places where they can be, probably more out in the territories where there's more pollen and more possibility for them to actually make the honey. Also thinking about how we can use community composting systems or small-scale composting systems to put a dent in that food waste that we're creating on a daily basis. And one of the simplest ways I've found is worm farming. And I've been talking to Sung about possibilities of getting some kind of worm farming demonstration happening. You were thinking possibly a worm tractor we were talking about that actually work attracting local worms into a compost system and getting them to process it. So watch this space on worm farming in Hong Kong with the Permaculture Institute, I think. This is some of the ideas that are being put forward by some. It's kind of, for me, it's a techno fix. Really, it's the high-rise, hydroponic, high-tech, high investment, high energy input type of thing. Is this the direction we want to go, or would we rather find another way to do it? Yes, no is my answer to it. Thank you.